There is a moment in Red Dead Redemption 2 that most players remember. Arthur Morgan sits on a cliff, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and he says something that cuts through all the gunfights and heists and chaos of the story. He says, "I gave you all I had." And in that moment you understand that this isn't just a game about outlaws in the dying West. It's a game about a man trying to figure out who he is before it's too late. Those 6 words carry the weight of an entire life. They're a statement of completion, of having held nothing back, of having given everything to the people and causes Arthur believed in. They're also a statement of exhaustion, of having nothing left, of being emptied out by a life of violence and sacrifice. And they're a statement of peace, of acceptance, of being ready to let go. In those final moments, Arthur achieves something rare and precious, a sense of wholeness. He's not perfect, he's not redeemed in any simple sense, but he's complete. He's done what he could with what he had. He's made his peace with who he was and who he became. He's ready. Arthur Morgan is one of the most psychologically complex characters in video game history. Not because he's mysterious or unpredictable, but because he's painfully, achingly human. He's a man shaped by trauma, defined by loyalty, and ultimately transformed by the slow realization that the life he's lived might not have been worth living. His journey isn't just a narrative arc, it's a psychological case study in identity formation, moral development, attachment theory, and the possibility of redemption. Let's begin at the beginning, not the beginning of the game, but the beginning of Arthur. Arthur Morgan was born around 1863, which means he came into the world during the Civil War. His father, Lyle Morgan, was a petty criminal who drifted in and out of Arthur's life. His mother died when Arthur was young, leaving him with fragmented memories and a locket he carries throughout the game. By the time Arthur was a teenager, his father had been arrested and hanged, leaving Arthur completely alone in a world that had never shown him much kindness. This early history establishes the foundation of Arthur's psychology. In developmental psychology, we talk about attachment theory. The idea that our earliest relationships shape how we relate to others for the rest of our lives. Children who experience secure attachment, with caregivers who are consistently present and responsive, tend to develop into adults who can form healthy relationships and regulate their emotions effectively. Children who experience insecure attachment, with caregivers who are absent, inconsistent, or abusive, often struggle with relationships and emotional regulation throughout their lives. Arthur experienced what psychologists would call disorganized attachment, the most severe form of insecure attachment. His mother died. His father was a criminal who was sometimes present and sometimes absent, and who modeled antisocial behavior as a way of life. There was no consistency, no safety, no reliable source of love or guidance. Arthur learned early that the world was dangerous, that people leave, and that he could only rely on himself. Children with disorganized attachment often develop what psychologists call internal working models that are contradictory and confusing. They want closeness but fear it. They need others but don't trust them. They seek attachment figures but expect those figures to hurt or abandon them. These contradictory expectations create a kind of psychological chaos that persists into adulthood. Arthur shows all the hallmarks of disorganized attachment. He forms intense bonds but keeps emotional distance. He's loyal to a fault but expects betrayal. He wants love but doesn't believe he deserves it. He seeks belonging but sabotages his own connections. These patterns aren't conscious choices. They're automatic responses shaped by early experience. The research on attachment shows that these patterns can be changed, but it requires what psychologists call earned secure attachment. This happens when a person with insecure attachment history develops new relationships that provide the consistency, safety, and responsiveness they lacked in childhood. Through these new relationships, they can revise their internal working models, learning that not everyone leaves, that some people can be trusted, that love is possible. Arthur's journey includes elements of earned secure attachment. His relationships with characters like Charles, Sadie, and Sister Calderon provide experiences of genuine connection, of being seen and valued, of trust being honoured. These relationships don't erase Arthur's attachment wounds, but they do begin to heal them. They show Arthur that his early experiences weren't the whole truth about relationships, that better is possible. This is crucial for understanding everything that comes later. When Dutch van der Linde found Arthur as a teenager, he wasn't just recruiting a gang member. He was offering something Arthur had never had: a father figure, a family, a sense of belonging. Dutch gave Arthur structure, purpose, and identity. He gave Arthur a philosophy to believe in and a role to play. For a boy who had been abandoned by everyone, this was everything. The relationship between Arthur and Dutch is the psychological core of Red Dead Redemption 2. It's not just a relationship between a leader and a follower. It's a relationship between a surrogate father and a surrogate son, with all the complexity and dysfunction that implies. Dutch van der Linde is a fascinating character in his own right, a charismatic narcissist who genuinely believes in his own mythology. He sees himself as a freedom fighter, a philosopher, a man standing against the encroachment of civilization and the corruption of modern society. His rhetoric is seductive. He speaks of loyalty, of family, of one more score that will set them all free. He makes people feel special, chosen, part of something larger than themselves. For Arthur, Dutch was the first person who ever made him feel like he mattered. Dutch saw potential in a scared, angry teenager and shaped him into something. He gave Arthur skills, confidence, and a sense of purpose. He told Arthur that he was family, that they would always look out for each other, that loyalty was the highest virtue. Arthur internalized all of this. He built his entire identity around being Dutch's right-hand man, the enforcer who made Dutch's vision possible. The psychological power of this relationship cannot be overstated. For a boy who had been abandoned by everyone, Dutch's attention was like water in a desert. Arthur would have done anything to maintain that connection, to keep feeling valued and important. And Dutch, consciously or not, used this need to bind Arthur to him. This is the psychology of what researchers call intermittent reinforcement, one of the most powerful mechanisms for creating attachment. Dutch didn't always praise Arthur. Sometimes he was critical, disappointed, distant. But when the praise came, it was intoxicating. Arthur never knew when he would receive Dutch's approval, so he was always striving for it, always trying to prove himself, always hoping that this time he would finally be good enough. Intermittent reinforcement creates bonds that are incredibly difficult to break. The uncertainty keeps the person hooked, always hoping, always trying. Arthur spent decades in this pattern, working tirelessly for Dutch's approval, never quite sure if he had it, always afraid of losing it. This is why Arthur's eventual break from Dutch is so psychologically significant. He's breaking a bond that was forged through decades of intermittent reinforcement. This is what psychologists call identity foreclosure, a concept from Erik Erikson's theory of identity development. Identity foreclosure occurs when a person commits to an identity without exploring alternatives, usually because that identity was handed to them by an authority figure. Arthur never questioned who he was supposed to be because Dutch told him who he was. He was an outlaw, a gang member, Dutch's boy. That was enough. That was everything. The problem with identity foreclosure is that it creates a fragile sense of self. When the identity is challenged, when the authority figure fails, the person has no internal resources to fall back on. They've never developed their own values, their own sense of who they are independent of external validation. This is exactly what happens to Arthur over the course of the game. But before we get to Arthur's transformation, we need to understand the psychological mechanisms that kept him loyal for so long. Arthur exhibits what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that occurs when a person holds contradictory beliefs or when their actions conflict with their values. Throughout the game, Arthur does terrible things. He kills people, he robs people, he intimidates and threatens and destroys, and yet he also shows compassion, helps strangers, and expresses doubt about the gang's direction. How does he reconcile these contradictions? The answer is that he doesn't, not really. Instead, he uses various psychological defense mechanisms to avoid confronting the contradiction. He tells himself that the people he hurts deserve it, or that he has no choice, or that it's all for the greater good of the gang. He compartmentalizes, keeping his violent actions separate from his sense of himself as a decent person. He rationalizes, finding reasons why each individual act was necessary or justified. Most importantly, he defers to Dutch. When Arthur has doubts, he looks to Dutch for reassurance. Dutch always has an explanation, always has a plan, always has a way of making the violence seem necessary and temporary. "One more score," Dutch says over and over, "have some faith." And Arthur wants to believe, needs to believe, because the alternative is admitting that his entire life has been built on a lie. This dynamic is common in abusive relationships and cult-like organizations. The leader provides meaning and identity, and the follower becomes psychologically dependent on the leader's approval. Any doubt is met with reassurance or guilt-tripping. The follower learns to suppress their own perceptions and defer to the leader's reality. Over time, the follower loses the ability to trust their own judgment. The psychological term for this loss of independent judgment is reality testing impairment. When we're deeply enmeshed with a charismatic leader, we start to see the world through their eyes rather than our own. We dismiss evidence that contradicts their narrative. We explain away behavior that should concern us. We lose touch with our own perceptions and values. Arthur's reality testing has been impaired for decades. He's seen Dutch do questionable things, but he's always found ways to explain them away. He's had doubts, but he's always suppressed them. He's trusted Dutch's version of reality over his own perceptions, even when his perceptions were more accurate. The tuberculosis diagnosis begins to restore Arthur's reality testing. When you're dying, you can't afford to live in someone else's reality. You have to see things clearly to make decisions based on what's actually happening, rather than what you wish were happening. Arthur's impending death strips away the comfortable illusions that have sustained him. This restoration of reality testing is painful but necessary. Arthur has to see Dutch clearly to acknowledge the manipulation and narcissism that were always there. He has to see the gang clearly, to recognise that it's falling apart and can't be saved. He has to see himself clearly, to acknowledge both his capacity for good and his history of harm. The game shows this process through Arthur's changing reactions to Dutch's speeches. Early in the game, Arthur nods along, accepts Dutch's explanations, defers to his judgment. Later, Arthur questions, challenges, expresses skepticism. He's no longer automatically accepting Dutch's reality. He's testing it against his own perceptions and finding it wanting. Arthur shows all of these patterns. He expresses doubt, but he always comes back to Dutch. He sees Dutch making increasingly erratic decisions, but he makes excuses. He watches Dutch become more paranoid and violent, but he tells himself that Dutch is under pressure, that Dutch will come through, that Dutch has always been right before. The psychological term for this is trauma bonding, the strong emotional attachment that forms between an abused person and their abuser. Let's examine the concept of learned helplessness and how it applies to Arthur's psychology. Learned helplessness is a psychological phenomenon where a person who has repeatedly experienced uncontrollable negative events comes to believe that they have no control over their circumstances. They stop trying to change their situation, even when change becomes possible, because they've learned that their efforts don't matter. Arthur shows signs of learned helplessness throughout much of the game. He complains about Dutch's decisions but doesn't seriously challenge them. He expresses doubt about the gang's direction but doesn't take action to change it. He seems to believe that his fate is sealed, that he has no real agency, that things will unfold as they will regardless of what he does. This learned helplessness makes psychological sense given Arthur's history. He grew up in chaos, with no control over whether his parents lived or died, whether he had food or shelter, whether he was safe or in danger. He learned early that the world was unpredictable and that his efforts to control it were futile. Dutch reinforced this learned helplessness by positioning himself as the one with the plan, the one who knew what to do. Arthur's role was to follow, not to lead. His job was to execute Dutch's vision, not to have visions of his own. Over decades, Arthur internalized the belief that he wasn't capable of independent thought or action. The tuberculosis diagnosis begins to break this pattern. When you're dying, the usual rules don't apply. Arthur has nothing left to lose, which paradoxically gives him freedom. He starts to challenge Dutch openly, to make his own decisions, to act according to his own values rather than Dutch's commands. This recovery from learned helplessness is one of the most important aspects of Arthur's transformation. He discovers that he does have agency, that his choices do matter, that he can influence outcomes even if he can't control them completely. This discovery is liberating, even as it comes too late to save his life. The psychology of shame is also central to understanding Arthur. Shame is different from guilt. Guilt is about what we've done. Shame is about who we are. Guilt says I did something bad. Shame says I am bad. Arthur carries deep shame, a fundamental belief that he is worthless, unlovable, irredeemable. This shame has multiple sources. His father's criminality and abandonment taught Arthur that he came from bad stock, that badness was in his blood. His outlaw life reinforced this belief, providing constant evidence that he was capable of terrible things. Dutch's philosophy, which celebrated outlaws as superior to civilized people, paradoxically deepened Arthur's shame by making his identity dependent on being an outsider, a reject, someone society had cast out, Shame is psychologically toxic. It leads to self-destructive behavior, relationship difficulties, depression, and despair. People who carry deep shame often sabotage good things in their lives because they don't believe they deserve them. They push away love because they can't believe anyone could truly love someone as worthless as they are. Arthur exhibits all of these patterns. He pushes Mary away, convinced he's not good enough for her. He dismisses compliments and expressions of care. He engages in self-destructive behavior, taking unnecessary risks, neglecting his health, putting himself in danger. His shame is a constant companion, whispering that he deserves whatever bad things happen to him. The transformation Arthur undergoes involves healing from shame. Through his interactions with people like Sister Calderon, who offer unconditional acceptance, Arthur begins to question his shame-based beliefs. Through his acts of kindness and compassion, he gathers evidence that he's capable of good. Through his growing self-awareness, he begins to separate his actions from his identity, recognizing that he's done bad things without being fundamentally bad. This healing is incomplete. Arthur never fully escapes his shame, but he makes progress, and that progress is visible in his final days. He faces death with dignity rather than self-loathing. He accepts love and gratitude from others. He believes, at least partially, that his life has mattered. This is significant growth for someone who spent decades convinced of his own worthlessness. Let's also examine the concept of moral injury in more depth. Moral injury occurs when a person participates in, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that violate their moral beliefs. Unlike PTSD, which is primarily about fear and threat, moral injury is about guilt, shame, and the violation of one's sense of right and wrong. Arthur has sustained severe moral injury over his lifetime. He has killed people, including people who probably didn't deserve to die. He has stolen from people who couldn't afford to lose what they had. He has participated in violence that destroyed families and communities. Even when he told himself these acts were necessary or justified, some part of him knew they were wrong. This moral injury manifests in Arthur's psychology in several ways. He has difficulty trusting himself, knowing that he's capable of terrible things. He has difficulty accepting love, believing that anyone who knew what he'd done would reject him. He has difficulty finding meaning, because his actions seem to negate any positive contribution he might make. The game shows Arthur beginning to heal from moral injury through several mechanisms. First, he acknowledges what he's done. He doesn't minimize or deny his actions. He faces them honestly, accepting responsibility without making excuses. This acknowledgement is painful but necessary for healing. Second, he makes amends where possible. He helps the Downs family, trying to repair some of the harm he caused. He protects innocent people, using his capacity for violence in service of good rather than evil. He gives money and assistance to those in need. These acts of repair don't undo the past, but they demonstrate that Arthur has changed, that he's no longer the person who caused that harm. Third, he develops a new moral framework. Arthur's old morality was based on loyalty to Dutch and the gang. His new morality is based on his own values, compassion, protection of the innocent, helping those in need. This new framework gives him guidance for how to act, a way of being good that doesn't depend on Dutch's approval. Fourth, he finds meaning in his suffering. Arthur comes to see his moral injury not just as damage, but as a teacher. His awareness of his own capacity for evil makes him more compassionate toward others who struggle. His guilt motivates him to be better. his suffering becomes a source of wisdom rather than just pain. Now let's talk about the other relationships in Arthur's life, because they're crucial to understanding his psychology. Hosea Matthews is the other father figure in Arthur's life, and he represents a different path. Where Dutch is charismatic and grandiose, Hosea is thoughtful and cautious. Where Dutch speaks of revolution and freedom, Hosea speaks of practicality and survival. Hosea is the voice of reason in the gang, the one who questions Dutch's plans and advocates for caution. Arthur's relationship with Hosea is warmer and more genuine than his relationship with Dutch. Hosea doesn't demand loyalty or use guilt to maintain control. He treats Arthur as an equal, respects his opinions, and genuinely cares about his well-being. In psychological terms, Hosea offers Arthur a model of secure attachment, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than dependency. But Arthur can't fully embrace Hosea's perspective because doing so would mean questioning Dutch. And questioning Dutch would mean questioning everything Arthur has built his life around. So Arthur remains caught between two father figures, unable to fully commit to either, unable to integrate their contradictory messages into a coherent worldview. John Marston represents something else entirely. John is Arthur's surrogate brother, but their relationship is complicated by resentment and competition. Arthur criticizes John for abandoning the gang, for being a poor father to Jack, for not pulling his weight. But underneath the criticism is something more complex. Arthur sees in John the possibility of a different life, and he resents John for having what Arthur never allowed himself to want. Arthur had a son once, Isaac, born to a waitress named Eliza. Arthur visited them when he could, brought them money, tried to be present in whatever limited way his outlaw life allowed. And then one day he rode up to their home and found 2 crosses in the ground. They had been killed for $10. Arthur never talks about this unless prompted, but it haunts him. It's the wound that never healed, the loss that taught him that he doesn't deserve good things, that anyone he loves will be taken from him. The psychological impact of losing a child is among the most severe traumas a person can experience. Research consistently shows that bereaved parents suffer higher rates of depression, anxiety, complicated grief, and even mortality than other bereaved individuals. The loss violates the natural order, the expectation that children will outlive their parents. It shatters assumptions about the world being safe and predictable. For Arthur, the loss of Isaac and Eliza was compounded by guilt. He wasn't there to protect them. His outlaw life, his choices, his absence, all contributed to their vulnerability. Arthur carries not just grief, but responsibility, the belief that their deaths were somehow his fault, that if he had been different, they might have lived. This guilt has shaped Arthur's psychology in profound ways. He doesn't allow himself to hope for good things because he believes he doesn't deserve them. He doesn't pursue relationships because he believes he'll only bring harm to those he loves. He doesn't imagine a future because he believes his future was buried with Isaac and Eliza. The loss also created what psychologists call complicated grief, a form of grief that doesn't resolve naturally over time. Normal grief, while painful, gradually integrates into a person's life. The bereaved person learns to live with the loss, to remember the deceased with love rather than just pain, to move forward while honouring what was lost. Complicated grief gets stuck. The bereaved person can't move forward, can't integrate the loss, can't find a way to live with what happened. They may avoid reminders of the deceased, or they may be obsessed with them. They may feel that life has no meaning without the person they lost, or they may feel guilty for any moments of happiness. Arthur shows signs of complicated grief throughout the game. He rarely mentions Isaac and Eliza, avoiding the pain of remembering. When he does mention them, the grief is raw, as if the loss happened yesterday rather than years ago. He hasn't integrated this loss into his life. He simply buried it, and it continues to shape him from below the surface of consciousness. The tuberculosis diagnosis brings this buried grief to the surface. Facing his own death, Arthur is forced to confront all the losses he's experienced, including the loss of his son. This confrontation is painful, but it's also potentially healing. By finally facing his grief, Arthur has the opportunity to process it, to integrate it, to find some peace with what happened. We see hints of this processing in Arthur's conversations about Isaac. When he talks about his son, there's still pain, but there's also something else. Acceptance, perhaps, or at least the beginning of acceptance. Arthur is starting to understand that Isaac's death wasn't entirely his fault, that he did the best he could with what he knew, that loving someone doesn't guarantee you can protect them. This is why Arthur pushes John away while simultaneously protecting him. John represents the family Arthur lost, the life Arthur could have had. By helping John, Arthur is trying to give John what he himself can never have. It's vicarious redemption, living through someone else because you believe you're beyond saving yourself. Mary Linton is the great love of Arthur's life, and their relationship reveals the depth of Arthur's self-loathing. Mary comes from a respectable family. She represents the legitimate world, the world of civilization and propriety that Dutch rails against. Arthur loved her, wanted to marry her, but he couldn't leave the gang, or wouldn't, or didn't know how. When Mary appears in the game, asking for Arthur's help, we see a man torn between two worlds. Arthur still loves her. That's obvious in every interaction. But he also believes he's not good enough for her, that he would only drag her down, that she deserves better than a dying outlaw. Mary, for her part, still loves Arthur, but can't accept his life. She keeps asking him to leave, and he keeps saying he will, and neither of them believes it. This relationship illustrates Arthur's core psychological wound. He doesn't believe he deserves love or happiness. Every time something good comes into his life, he sabotages it or pushes it away. He tells himself it's because of circumstances, because of the gang, because of duty. But the truth is that Arthur has internalized the message that he's worthless, that he's a bad man who does bad things, and that good things aren't meant for people like him. Psychologists call this a negative self-schema, a deeply held belief about oneself that filters all incoming information. Arthur's negative self-schema tells him that he's fundamentally bad. When good things happen, he dismisses them as flukes or mistakes. When bad things happen, he sees them as confirmation of what he already knew. This schema was formed in childhood, reinforced by his outlaw life, and maintained by the cognitive distortions that keep him from seeing himself clearly. Now let's talk about the turning point, the moment when everything changes. Arthur Morgan is diagnosed with tuberculosis after beating a debtor named Thomas Downs. The diagnosis is a death sentence. In 1899, there was no cure for tuberculosis. Arthur is going to die, and he knows it. This is the catalyst for Arthur's psychological transformation, but it's important to understand why. It's not just that Arthur is facing death. It's that the diagnosis forces him to confront questions he's been avoiding his entire life. Who is he? What has his life meant? What will he leave behind? The psychological impact of a terminal diagnosis is profound and well documented. Research shows that people who receive such diagnoses often go through a period of intense psychological upheaval, followed by either deterioration or growth. The direction depends on many factors: social support, pre-existing psychological resources, the meaning the person makes of their situation. Arthur's initial response to the diagnosis is denial and isolation. He doesn't tell anyone. He tries to continue as if nothing has changed. This is a common first response to overwhelming news. The mind needs time to process information that threatens its fundamental assumptions about reality. But denial can only last so long. The physical symptoms of tuberculosis are impossible to ignore. Arthur coughs blood, loses weight, struggles to breathe. His body forces him to confront what his mind wants to avoid. This is actually psychologically helpful in a painful way. It prevents Arthur from getting stuck in denial, forces him to move through the stages of grief. The anger stage is visible in Arthur's increasing confrontations with Dutch and Micah. He becomes more willing to express disagreement, more likely to challenge decisions he thinks are wrong. Some of this anger is displaced, directed at external targets because it's easier than being angry at the disease, at fate, at the unfairness of dying young. The bargaining stage is more subtle. Arthur doesn't literally bargain with God or fate, but he does engage in a kind of psychological bargaining. He tells himself that if he can just help John escape, if he can just make amends for some of his wrongs, if he can just do some good before he dies, then maybe his life will have meant something. This bargaining gives him purpose and direction, even if it can't change the ultimate outcome. The depression stage is perhaps the most visible. Arthur becomes more somber, more reflective, more prone to moments of despair. He expresses hopelessness about his situation, about the gang, about the world. He withdraws from some relationships, unable to maintain the energy required for connection. This depression is not pathological. It's a natural response to loss, a necessary part of grieving. The acceptance stage comes gradually, in fits and starts. Arthur begins to accept that he's going to die, that he can't change this, that his only choice is how he faces it. This acceptance is not resignation or giving up. It's a clear-eyed acknowledgement of reality that paradoxically frees Arthur to act. Once he accepts that he's dying, he can focus on what he wants to do with the time he has left. The psychologist William Worden developed a task model of grief that's useful for understanding Arthur's journey. Worden argued that grieving involves 4 tasks: accepting the reality of the loss, processing the pain of grief, adjusting to a world without what was lost, and finding an enduring connection while embarking on a new life. Arthur works through all 4 tasks. He accepts the reality of his impending death, stops denying or avoiding it. He processes the pain, allowing himself to feel grief, fear, and sadness. He adjusts to a world where he won't exist, making plans for others, letting go of attachments, and he finds an enduring connection through his legacy, through the people he helps, through the meaning he creates. This grief work is not linear. Arthur moves back and forth between stages and tasks, sometimes making progress and sometimes regressing. This is psychologically realistic. Grief is messy, unpredictable, non-linear. The game captures this messiness, showing Arthur having good days and bad days, moments of peace and moments of despair. The psychologist Erik Erikson described the final stage of human development as ego integrity versus despair. In this stage, typically occurring in old age, people look back on their lives and either feel a sense of satisfaction and meaning, or they feel regret and despair. Arthur is forced into this stage prematurely. He's not old, but he's dying, and he has to reckon with the life he's lived. What Arthur sees when he looks back is not comforting. He sees violence, theft, murder. He sees people he's hurt, families he's destroyed, lives he's ended. He sees a man who followed orders without questioning, who did terrible things because someone told him to, who never stopped to ask if any of it was right. The despair is overwhelming. But despair is not the only option. Erikson believed that even at the end of life, people can find meaning and integrity. They can acknowledge their mistakes, make amends where possible, and find peace with who they've been. This is the path Arthur begins to walk. The tuberculosis diagnosis doesn't change Arthur overnight. Psychological transformation is a process, not an event. But it creates the conditions for change by stripping away Arthur's defences. He can no longer tell himself that there's always tomorrow, that he'll figure things out eventually, that one more score will fix everything. There is no more eventually. There is only now. This is what existential psychologists call confrontation with mortality. When we truly face the reality of our own death, it can shake us out of our habitual patterns and force us to examine what really matters. For Arthur, this confrontation reveals that much of what he thought mattered, the gang, Dutch's approval, the outlaw life, doesn't matter at all. What matters is the people he loves and the kind of person he wants to be in the time he has left. The game tracks Arthur's transformation through the honor system, but the psychological transformation goes deeper than a meter on the screen. We see it in Arthur's journal entries, which become more reflective and philosophical as the game progresses. We see it in his conversations, where he begins to question Dutch openly and express his own opinions. We see it in his actions, as he increasingly chooses compassion over violence, mercy over revenge. One of the most powerful aspects of Arthur's transformation is his growing awareness of his own psychology. Early in the game, Arthur doesn't think much about why he does what he does. He's an outlaw because that's what he is. He follows Dutch because that's what he's always done. But as the game progresses, Arthur begins to examine his own motivations, his own patterns, his own wounds. In his journal, Arthur writes about his father, about Eliza and Isaac, about Mary. He writes about his doubts and fears. He writes about the kind of man he wishes he could be. This self-reflection is itself a sign of psychological growth. Arthur is developing what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking. He's stepping back from his automatic patterns and examining them critically. This self-awareness allows Arthur to make different choices. When he understands why he's been loyal to Dutch, he can begin to question that loyalty. When he understands why he pushes people away, he can begin to let them in. When he understands why he believes he's worthless, he can begin to challenge that belief. Let's examine the psychology of Arthur's creative expression, particularly his journal and drawings. Arthur's journal is one of the most psychologically revealing aspects of his character. He writes regularly, documenting his experiences, thoughts, and feelings. He draws what he sees, capturing landscapes, animals, people, and object with careful attention to detail. This creative expression serves multiple psychological functions. First, the journal provides a space for self-reflection. When Arthur writes about his experiences, he's not just recording events, he's processing them, making sense of them, integrating them into his understanding of himself and the world. The act of writing forces him to articulate thoughts and feelings that might otherwise remain vague and unexamined. Research on expressive writing shows that putting experiences into words can have significant psychological benefits. It helps people process trauma, reduce stress, and gain insight into their own patterns. Arthur's journal serves this function, providing a private space where he can be honest with himself in ways he can't be with others. Second, the drawings reveal Arthur's aesthetic sensitivity and his capacity for presence. To draw something well, you have to really look at it. You have to notice details, appreciate forms, be present with what you're seeing. Arthur's drawings show us a man who pays attention, who notices beauty, who takes time to appreciate the world around him. This aesthetic engagement is psychologically healthy. It connects Arthur to something beyond his immediate concerns, provides moments of flow and absorption, cultivates gratitude and wonder. In a life filled with violence and stress, these moments of creative engagement offer respite and renewal. Third, the journal serves as a form of legacy. Arthur knows he's dying, and the journal is something that will survive him. It's a record of who he was, what he thought, how he saw the world. In a sense, Arthur is writing himself into existence, creating a version of himself that will outlast his physical body. The evolution of Arthur's journal entries over the course of the game is psychologically significant. Early entries tend to be brief, practical, focused on external events. Later entries become more reflective, more philosophical, more emotionally honest. This evolution mirrors Arthur's psychological growth, his increasing capacity for self-awareness and emotional expression. The drawings also evolve. Early drawings are often quick sketches, competent but not deeply engaged. Later drawings show more care, more attention, more artistic ambition. Arthur is developing as an artist even as he's dying, finding new depths of creative expression in his final months. This creative development is not incidental to Arthur's psychological transformation, it's part of it. By engaging creatively with the world, Arthur is practicing presence, cultivating beauty, expressing his inner life. These practices support and reinforce his broader psychological growth. Let's also examine the psychology of Arthur's sense of place and belonging. Throughout the game, Arthur moves through different landscapes: mountains, plains, swamps, forests, towns. Each environment has its own character, its own mood, its own psychological impact. Arthur's relationship with these places reveals important aspects of his psychology. Arthur is most at peace in wild places, away from civilization. He loves the mountains, the open plains, the quiet forests. These places offer him solitude, beauty, and freedom from the complications of human society. In nature, Arthur can be himself without performance or pretense. This preference for wild places reflects Arthur's ambivalence about civilization. He's an outlaw, an outsider, someone who doesn't fit in the respectable world. Wild places accept him in a way that towns and cities don't. They don't judge him, don't demand that he be something he's not, don't remind him of his failures and crimes. But Arthur's relationship with place is also about belonging. The gang's camps are home to Arthur, the closest thing to a stable place he's ever had. When the camps move, when the gang fractures, Arthur loses his sense of home. He becomes unmoored without a place where he belongs. This loss of place mirrors Arthur's psychological disintegration and reconstruction. As the gang falls apart, Arthur has to find new sources of belonging, new ways of being at home in the world. He finds this partly through his connections with individuals like Charles and Sadie, partly through his relationship with nature, partly through his growing sense of internal home, a sense of being at peace with himself regardless of external circumstances. The game's final image, Arthur watching the sunrise from a mountain, is significant in this context. Arthur has found a place, not a home in the social sense, but a place where he belongs, where he can be at peace, where he can die with dignity. The mountain doesn't care that he's an outlaw. The sunrise doesn't judge his crimes. In this wild place, Arthur is simply a human being facing the end of his life. The relationship between Arthur and the player is crucial here. Red Dead Redemption 2 gives players significant control over Arthur's actions. You can play Arthur as a ruthless killer or as a compassionate helper. You can rob and murder, or you can help strangers and show mercy. The game tracks these choices through the honor system, and they affect how the story unfolds. But here's what's psychologically interesting. Regardless of how you play, Arthur's internal journey remains largely the same. Even a low honor Arthur questions Dutch, reflects on his life, and seeks some form of meaning before the end. The game is suggesting that the capacity for self-reflection and moral growth exists in everyone, even those who have done terrible things. The question is whether we choose to engage that capacity. This is consistent with psychological research on moral development. Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development suggests that people can progress through stages of moral reasoning, from self-interest to social conformity to principled ethics. Most people don't reach the higher stages, but the capacity is there. Arthur's journey represents a compressed version of this development, as he moves from unquestioning obedience to Dutch, to developing his own moral principles. Let's examine some specific moments that illustrate Arthur's psychological transformation. The mission with Sister Calderon is one of the most important. Arthur encounters a nun who is helping the poor and sick. They have a conversation about faith, redemption, and the possibility of change. Arthur admits that he's afraid, that he doesn't know if he's a good man, that he's done terrible things. Sister Calderon doesn't judge him. She tells him that it's never too late to change, that redemption is possible for anyone who truly seeks it. The psychological significance of this encounter cannot be overstated. Sister Calderon represents what psychologists call a secure base, a relationship characterized by unconditional positive regard, empathy, and authenticity. These are the conditions that Carl Rogers identified as necessary for psychological growth. Unconditional positive regard means accepting someone without judgment, valuing them as a person regardless of their behaviour. Sister Calderon doesn't know the details of Arthur's crimes, but she also doesn't need to. She accepts him as a human being worthy of compassion, period. This acceptance is revolutionary for Arthur, who has spent his life believing that he's fundamentally unacceptable. Empathy means understanding someone's experience from their perspective, feeling with them rather than just about them. Sister Calderon demonstrates empathy by acknowledging Arthur's fear, his struggle, his desire to be better. She doesn't minimize his pain or offer easy platitudes. She meets him where he is. Authenticity means being genuine, not hiding behind a role or facade. Sister Calderon is authentically herself, a woman of faith who has dedicated her life to helping others. Her authenticity gives Arthur permission to be authentic too, to drop his own facade and speak honestly about his fears and hopes. These conditions create what Rogers called a growth-promoting climate, an environment where psychological change becomes possible. In Sister Calderon's presence, Arthur can explore parts of himself he usually keeps hidden. He can admit vulnerability, express doubt, ask questions he's never asked before. The conversation also introduces Arthur to a different way of thinking about redemption. Dutch's philosophy was about justification, about explaining why the gang's actions were acceptable. Sister Calderon's philosophy is about transformation, about becoming a different person regardless of what you've done. This shift from justification to transformation is crucial for Arthur's psychological development. Sister Calderon doesn't tell Arthur that his crimes were okay. She doesn't offer cheap forgiveness or easy absolution. Instead, she offers something more valuable, the possibility of change. She suggests that Arthur's past doesn't have to determine his future, that he can choose to be different, that redemption is a process rather than an event. This message resonates with Arthur because it matches his emerging experience. He is changing. He is becoming different. He is making choices that his earlier self wouldn't have made. Sister Calderon's words give him a framework for understanding this change, a way of making sense of his own transformation. The encounter also models a different kind of strength. Sister Calderon is not physically powerful, not armed, not dangerous in any conventional sense. Yet she has a kind of strength that Arthur recognizes and respects. The strength to face suffering without being destroyed by it, to maintain hope in the face of despair, to keep helping others even when the task seems hopeless. This is the strength Arthur is developing in his final months, not the strength of violence, which he's always had, but the strength of compassion, of persistence, of faith in the possibility of good. Sister Calderon shows him what this strength looks like, gives him a model to aspire to. This conversation is significant because it offers Arthur something he's never had: unconditional acceptance. Sister Calderon doesn't know about Arthur's crimes, but she also doesn't need to. She accepts him as a human being worthy of compassion, regardless of his past. For someone with Arthur's negative self-schema, this is revolutionary. It challenges his core belief that he's fundamentally bad and unworthy of love. The mission with Rainsfall is equally important. Rainsfall is the chief of the Wapiti tribe, a man who has lost almost everything to the encroachment of white civilization. He's lost his land, his people, his way of life, and yet he advocates for peace, for finding a way forward that doesn't involve more violence and death. Arthur is initially skeptical. He spent his whole life solving problems with violence. But Rainsfall offers a different perspective. He talks about the futility of revenge, the importance of protecting what remains rather than fighting for what's lost. He models a kind of wisdom that Arthur has never encountered, a way of facing loss and injustice without becoming consumed by bitterness. Through his interactions with Rainsfall, Arthur begins to see that there are other ways to be strong. Strength doesn't have to mean violence. Courage doesn't have to mean aggression. A man can face terrible circumstances and still choose peace, still choose compassion, still choose to protect rather than destroy. Rainsfall also introduces Arthur to a different relationship with loss. The chief has lost almost everything: his land, his people, his way of life, his son's respect. Yet he hasn't become bitter or vengeful. He's found a way to carry his losses without being crushed by them, to honour what was lost while still engaging with what remains. This is a model Arthur desperately needs. He's facing his own losses, his health, his family, his future, his sense of self. He could respond to these losses with bitterness, with rage, with despair. Rain's Fall shows him another way: acceptance without resignation, grief without destruction, loss without losing oneself. The psychological concept of radical acceptance is relevant here. Radical acceptance means fully accepting reality as it is, without judgment or resistance. It doesn't mean approving of reality or giving up on change. It means acknowledging what is, so that you can respond effectively rather than being trapped in denial or rage. Rain's Fall embodies radical acceptance. He accepts that his people have been wronged, that injustice has occurred, that the world is not as it should be. But he doesn't let this acceptance paralyze him. Instead, he focuses on what he can do: protect his remaining people, preserve what can be preserved, find meaning in the struggle even if victory is impossible. Arthur learns from this example. He begins to practice his own form of radical acceptance, acknowledging that he's dying, that the gang is falling apart, that Dutch has changed, that the world he knew is ending. This acceptance is painful, but it's also liberating. Once Arthur stops fighting reality, he can focus on what he can actually do with the time and resources he has. The relationship between Arthur and Rain's Fall also highlights the theme of intergenerational wisdom. Rain's Fall is older than Arthur, has lived through more, has had more time to develop wisdom. He represents what Arthur might have become if he'd had different circumstances, different teachers, different choices. Their conversations are a kind of mentorship, with Rain's Fall passing on wisdom that Arthur can use in his final days. This intergenerational transmission is psychologically important. We don't develop wisdom in isolation. We learn from those who came before us, who faced similar challenges, who found ways to navigate difficulty. Arthur's encounter with Rain's Fall gives him access to wisdom he couldn't have developed on his own. Wisdom that helps him face his own death with greater equanimity. The mission where Arthur helps the Downes family is perhaps the most psychologically significant. Thomas Downes was the man Arthur beat while collecting debts, the man who gave Arthur tuberculosis. After Thomas dies, his wife and son are left destitute, forced into prostitution and degradation to survive. The psychological complexity of this situation is remarkable. Arthur is dying because of Thomas Downes, because of the tuberculosis he contracted during that brutal encounter. He could easily blame Downes, could see himself as the victim, could feel justified in ignoring the family's suffering. After all, Downes gave him a death sentence. Why should Arthur help his family? But Arthur doesn't think this way. Instead, he takes responsibility. He recognizes that he was the aggressor, that he beat a sick man for money, that his violence set in motion a chain of events that destroyed a family. The fact that this violence also destroyed Arthur doesn't change his culpability. If anything, it deepens his understanding of how violence ripples outward, harming everyone it touches. This capacity to take responsibility, even when it would be easier to blame others, is a sign of psychological maturity. Immature people externalize blame, seeing themselves as victims of circumstance, refusing to acknowledge their role in creating their problems, Mature people can hold complexity, can recognize that they are both victims and perpetrators, both harmed and harmful. Arthur's decision to help the Downs family is also an example of what psychologists call reparative action. When we've caused harm, we have several options. We can deny the harm, minimize it, or blame the victim. Or we can acknowledge the harm and try to repair it. Reparative action doesn't undo the original harm, but it demonstrates that we've changed, that we're no longer the person who caused that harm. The Downs missions are emotionally difficult for Arthur. He has to face the consequences of his violence directly, to see the suffering he caused, to acknowledge his role in destroying a family. This is painful, but it's also necessary for his psychological healing. By facing what he did, Arthur can begin to integrate it, to accept it as part of his history without being defined by it. The missions also give Arthur a concrete way to make amends. He can't bring Thomas Downs back to life. He can't undo the beating, but he can help the family survive, can give them money and protection, can try to ensure that they have a future even though Thomas doesn't. This concrete action is psychologically important. It transforms Arthur's guilt from a paralyzing weight into a motivating force. Arthur could ignore them. He could tell himself that it's not his fault, that he was just doing his job, that they're not his responsibility. But he doesn't. He seeks them out. He helps them. He gives them money and protection. He tries to make amends for what he did. This is the essence of psychological redemption. Arthur can't undo the past. He can't bring Thomas Downs back to life. He can't cure his own tuberculosis, but he can acknowledge the harm he caused and try to make it right. He can take responsibility for his actions and their consequences. He can choose to be different going forward, even if going forward is measured in weeks rather than years. The psychological term for this is making amends, and it's a crucial part of recovery from guilt and shame. When we've done wrong, we carry that wrong with us. It weighs on us, shapes how we see ourselves, affects our relationships and our choices. Making amends doesn't erase the wrong, but it does something important. It demonstrates that we've changed, that we're not the same person who did that thing, that we're capable of better. For Arthur, helping the Downs family is proof that he can be more than what he's been. It's evidence against his negative self-schema. Every time he chooses compassion over violence, every time he helps someone instead of hurting them, he's building a new identity, a new sense of who he is and who he can be. Now let's talk about Dutch's deterioration and how it affects Arthur's psychology. Throughout the game, Dutch becomes increasingly erratic, paranoid, and violent. He makes decisions that endanger the gang. He refuses to listen to advice. He becomes obsessed with enemies real and imagined. He kills people unnecessarily. He abandons gang members in danger. The man Arthur knew, or thought he knew, is disappearing. This is devastating for Arthur on multiple levels. On a practical level, Dutch's poor leadership is getting people killed and making their situation worse. But on a psychological level, something even more profound is happening. Arthur is watching his father figure, the man who defined his identity, reveal himself to be something other than what Arthur believed. Psychologists call this disillusionment, and it's one of the most painful experiences a person can have. When we build our identity around another person, when we invest them with authority and wisdom and goodness, discovering that they're flawed or corrupt doesn't just change how we see them, it changes how we see ourselves. If Dutch was never the man Arthur thought he was, then who is Arthur? What has his life been for? The stages of Arthur's disillusionment mirror the stages of grief. First, there's denial. Arthur makes excuses for Dutch, tells himself that Dutch is under pressure, that Dutch will come through. Then there's anger, as Arthur begins to confront Dutch about his decisions and express his frustration. Then bargaining, as Arthur tries to find ways to make things work, to salvage the gang and the family he's known. Then depression, as Arthur realizes that the gang is falling apart and there's nothing he can do to stop it. And finally, acceptance, as Arthur lets go of his attachment to Dutch and the gang and focuses on what he can control. This process of disillusionment is one of the most painful experiences in human psychology. When we invest our identity in another person, when we build our sense of self around their approval and guidance, discovering their flaws doesn't just change how we see them, it changes how we see ourselves, our past, our entire life story. Arthur has to reckon with the possibility that Dutch was never the man Arthur thought he was. Maybe Dutch was always capable of the cruelty and selfishness he now displays. Maybe the philosophy Arthur believed in was always a rationalization for violence. Maybe the family Arthur loved was always built on lies. These questions are psychologically devastating because they threaten to invalidate Arthur's entire life. If Dutch was always a fraud, then what was Arthur's loyalty worth? If the gang's philosophy was always hollow, then what did Arthur's sacrifices mean? If the family was always dysfunctional, then where does Arthur belong? The psychological work Arthur has to do is to separate his own value from Dutch's value. He has to recognize that his loyalty was real even if Dutch didn't deserve it, that his sacrifices mattered even if they were misdirected, that his capacity for love and commitment is valuable regardless of whether the object of that love was worthy. This is incredibly difficult psychological work. It requires Arthur to develop a sense of self that's independent of Dutch, to find sources of value and meaning that don't depend on Dutch's approval. It requires him to grieve not just the loss of Dutch as he is now, but the loss of the Dutch Arthur thought he knew, the idealized father figure who never really existed. The game shows Arthur doing this work gradually and painfully. He stops looking to Dutch for guidance and starts trusting his own judgment. He stops seeking Dutch's approval and starts acting according to his own values. He stops defining himself as Dutch's man and starts defining himself as his own man. This differentiation is one of the most important psychological achievements of Arthur's final months. This process is complicated by Micah Bell, who represents everything Arthur is not. Micah is cruel, selfish, and manipulative. He has no loyalty except to himself. He whispers in Dutch's ear, encouraging his worst impulses, driving wedges between Dutch and those who question him. Arthur sees what Micah is doing, but Dutch doesn't, or won't. The dynamic between Arthur, Dutch, and Micah is a classic triangulation pattern. Micah positions himself as Dutch's true loyal follower, implicitly casting Arthur as disloyal for questioning Dutch's decisions. Dutch, whose narcissism makes him susceptible to flattery, increasingly favours Micah over Arthur. Arthur, who has been loyal for decades, watches himself being replaced by someone he knows is toxic. This is psychologically excruciating. Arthur's entire identity has been built around being Dutch's right-hand man, the one Dutch could always count on. To be displaced by Micah, to watch Dutch choose Micah's counsel over his, is a profound rejection. It confirms Arthur's worst fears about himself, that he's not good enough, that his loyalty doesn't matter, that he can be discarded like everyone else in his life. But here's where Arthur's psychological growth becomes apparent. Earlier in his life, this rejection might have destroyed him. He might have doubled down on his loyalty, trying desperately to win back Dutch's favour. Or he might have become bitter and vengeful, turning against Dutch entirely. Instead, Arthur does something more mature. He accepts the reality of who Dutch is and focuses on what he can do with the time he has left. This is what psychologists call differentiation, the process of developing a sense of self that's separate from others. Arthur is finally becoming his own person, with his own values and his own judgment. He's no longer defining himself through Dutch's approval. He's defining himself through his own choices and actions. The final confrontation between Arthur and Dutch is the culmination of this process. Arthur tells Dutch the truth, that Dutch has changed, that he's lost his way, that the gang is falling apart because of his decisions. Dutch responds with denial and deflection, unable to accept responsibility. And Arthur finally lets go. He stops trying to save Dutch. He stops hoping Dutch will change. He accepts that Dutch is who he is, and he focuses on saving the people he can save. This is an incredibly healthy psychological response to an unhealthy relationship. Arthur is setting boundaries, accepting reality, and prioritizing his own values over his attachment to Dutch. It's the kind of growth that many people never achieve, even with years of therapy. Arthur achieves it in months, driven by the urgency of his impending death. Let's talk about Arthur's relationship with death itself. Arthur's response to his diagnosis evolves over the course of the game. Initially, there's shock and denial. He doesn't tell anyone. He tries to continue as if nothing has changed, but the disease progresses and denial becomes impossible. Arthur begins coughing blood, losing weight, struggling to breathe. The physical reality of his dying body forces him to confront what's happening. The psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross famously described 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Arthur moves through all of these, though not in a linear fashion. He denies the diagnosis, then rages against it, then tries to find meaning in his remaining time, then sinks into despair, and finally reaches a kind of peace. But Arthur's relationship with death is more complex than the stage model suggests. He's not just grieving his own death. He's grieving the life he didn't live, the person he didn't become, the choices he didn't make. He's grieving Isaac and Eliza. He's grieving his relationship with Mary. He's grieving the family he could have had, the man he could have been. This is what existential psychologists call existential guilt. The recognition that we have not lived up to our potential, that we've wasted opportunities, that we have failed to become who we could have been. Existential guilt is different from neurotic guilt, which is about specific actions. Existential guilt is about the whole shape of a life, the pattern of choices that led to where we are. Arthur feels both kinds of guilt. He feels neurotic guilt about specific people he's hurt, specific crimes he's committed, and he feels existential guilt about the life he's lived, the person he's been, the potential he's squandered. Both kinds of guilt drive his transformation, pushing him to make different choices in the time he has left. The remarkable thing about Arthur is that he doesn't let guilt paralyze him. Many people, when confronted with the weight of their mistakes, become stuck. They ruminate endlessly, unable to move forward. They punish themselves, believing they deserve to suffer. They give up, deciding that change is impossible. Arthur does none of these things. He acknowledges his guilt, feels it fully, and then uses it as motivation to be better. He doesn't wallow in self-pity. He doesn't seek punishment. He seeks redemption, not in the sense of erasing his past, but in the sense of creating a different future, however brief. This is psychologically sophisticated. Arthur is practicing what psychologists call self-compassion, the ability to acknowledge our failures without being destroyed by them. Self-compassion doesn't mean letting ourselves off the hook. It means treating ourselves with the same kindness we would offer a friend, recognizing that everyone makes mistakes and focusing on growth rather than punishment. Arthur's journal entries in the late game are filled with self-compassion. He writes about his regrets, but he also writes about his hopes. He acknowledges the bad he's done, but he also recognizes the good he's capable of. He's hard on himself, but not cruel. He's honest, but not hopeless. Let's examine Arthur's final days and what they reveal about his psychology. As the game approaches its conclusion, Arthur becomes increasingly focused on helping others escape the collapsing gang. He helps John and his family. He helps Sadie and Charles. He tries to protect the people he cares about from the consequences of Dutch's decisions. This focus on others is significant. Psychologists have found that one of the most effective ways to find meaning in life is through what Viktor Frankl called self-transcendence, focusing on something beyond ourselves. Arthur can't save himself, but he can save others. He can't undo his past, but he can shape their future. By helping John escape, Arthur is giving John the chance at the life Arthur never had. There's also an element of what psychologists call generativity, the desire to contribute to future generations. He can't undo the harm he caused, but he can choose how he faces the end. He can choose to die fighting for something good, protecting someone he loves, giving everything he has one last time, and that choice matters. It doesn't erase the past, but it completes the story. It gives Arthur's life a shape, a meaning, a purpose. He was a bad man who did bad things, but in the end, he was also a man who loved, who sacrificed, who tried to be better. Both things are true. Both things are Arthur. Let's examine the specific psychological mechanisms that drive Arthur's transformation in more detail. One of the most important concepts for understanding Arthur is what psychologists call cognitive restructuring. This is the process of identifying and changing distorted thought patterns. Arthur's thinking at the beginning of the game is full of distortions. He engages in black and white thinking, seeing people as either loyal or disloyal, with no middle ground. He catastrophizes, assuming the worst about himself and his future. He engages in emotional reasoning, believing that because he feels like a bad person, he must be a bad person. As the game progresses, Arthur begins to challenge these distortions. He starts to see nuance where he once saw only extremes. He begins to question his automatic negative thoughts about himself. He starts to separate his feelings from facts, recognizing that feeling worthless doesn't make him worthless. This cognitive restructuring is visible in Arthur's journal entries. Early entries are often harsh and self-critical. Later entries show more balance, more nuance, more self-compassion. Arthur is literally rewriting his internal narrative, changing the story he tells himself about who he is. The game also illustrates the concept of behavioral activation, a therapeutic technique where people engage in meaningful activities to combat depression and hopelessness. Arthur's side missions, helping strangers, exploring the world, engaging with nature, serve this function. They give him purpose, connection, and a sense of accomplishment that counteracts his despair. When Arthur helps a stranger on the road, he's not just being kind, he's proving to himself that he's capable of kindness. When he explores a beautiful vista, he's not just sightseeing, he's reconnecting with beauty and wonder. When he writes in his journal, he's not just recording events, he's processing his experiences and making meaning from them. These activities might seem small compared to the grand drama of the main story, but psychologically they're crucial. They're the building blocks of Arthur's transformation, the daily practices that gradually reshape his sense of self. Let's also consider the role of emotional regulation in Arthur's journey. Emotional regulation refers to the ability to manage and respond to emotional experiences in healthy ways. Arthur's emotional regulation at the beginning of the game is poor. He suppresses his emotions, avoiding feelings rather than processing them. When emotions do emerge, they often come out as anger or violence, the only emotional expressions that feel safe for an outlaw. This pattern is common in people who have experienced trauma. Trauma disrupts the development of healthy emotional regulation, leaving people with limited tools for managing their inner lives. Arthur learned early that emotions were dangerous, that vulnerability was weakness, that the only safe response to pain was to shut down or lash out. The tuberculosis diagnosis forces Arthur to confront emotions he's been avoiding for decades. He can't suppress the fear of death, the grief over his wasted life, the longing for connection and meaning. These emotions demand to be felt, and Arthur gradually learns to feel them. We see this in his conversations with other characters. Arthur becomes more willing to express vulnerability, to admit fear, to acknowledge love. He tells John that he sees him as a brother. He tells Sister Calderon that he's afraid. He tells Mary that he still loves her. These admissions would have been impossible for the Arthur of Chapter 1. This emotional opening is both painful and healing. Arthur feels things he's been avoiding for years, and it hurts. But feeling these emotions also allows him to process them, to integrate them, to move through them rather than being stuck. His emotional life becomes richer, more complex, more fully human. The concept of meaning-making is central to understanding Arthur's transformation. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps, argued that the primary human drive is not pleasure or power, but meaning. People can endure almost anything if they can find meaning in their suffering. Conversely, people with comfortable lives can fall into despair if they lack a sense of purpose. Arthur's crisis is fundamentally a crisis of meaning. For years, his life had meaning through his role in the gang, his loyalty to Dutch, his identity as an outlaw. When these sources of meaning collapse, Arthur is left with nothing. He's dying, his family is falling apart, and everything he believed in has been revealed as a lie. The game shows Arthur actively searching for new sources of meaning. He finds meaning in helping others, in protecting the vulnerable, in giving John a chance at a better life. He finds meaning in his connections with people like Charles, Sadie, and Sister Calderon. He finds meaning in his appreciation of beauty, his love of nature, his creative expression through drawing. These new sources of meaning don't erase Arthur's suffering, but they make it bearable. They give him a reason to keep going, a purpose that transcends his own survival. Frankl would recognize Arthur's journey as a textbook example of finding meaning in the face of death. The game also illustrates the concept of legacy, and its psychological importance. As Arthur faces death, he becomes increasingly concerned with what he'll leave behind. This concern with legacy is a natural response to mortality. When we know we're going to die, we want to know that our lives mattered, that we made a difference, that something of us will continue after we're gone. Arthur's legacy concerns take several forms. He wants to help Jon and his family escape, giving them a chance at the life he never had. He wants to make amends for the harm he's caused, leaving the world a little better than he found it. He wants to be remembered as someone who tried to be good, even if he didn't always succeed. This concern with legacy is psychologically healthy. It connects Arthur to something larger than himself, to the future he won't live to see. It gives his final actions meaning and purpose. It transforms his death from a mere ending into a contribution, a gift to those who will live on. The game reinforces this through its epilogue, where we see the consequences of Arthur's choices. Jon and his family are alive because of Arthur. The gang members who escaped did so because of Arthur's sacrifices. Arthur's legacy lives on, even though Arthur himself is gone. Let's examine the psychology of Arthur's relationship with his own body. For most of his life, Arthur's body was a tool, a weapon, a source of strength and capability. He didn't think much about it because it worked. It did what he needed it to do. His identity was partly based on this physical competence, on being strong and capable and dangerous. The tuberculosis changes everything. Arthur's body becomes a source of limitation rather than capability. It betrays him, fails him, reminds him constantly of his mortality. Every cough is a reminder that he's dying. Every moment of weakness is a confrontation with his own vulnerability. This experience of bodily betrayal is psychologically devastating. When our bodies fail us, we're forced to reckon with our fundamental fragility, with the fact that we are physical beings subject to decay and death. Arthur can no longer take his body for granted. He has to live with its limitations, adapt to its decline, accept its eventual failure. But this confrontation with bodily vulnerability also opens new possibilities. Arthur begins to value his body differently, appreciating what it can still do rather than mourning what it can't. He becomes more present in his physical experience, more aware of sensations and pleasures he previously ignored. His relationship with his body becomes more conscious, more intentional, more appreciative. This shift is visible in small moments throughout the game. Arthur pauses to watch a sunset, feeling the warmth on his face. He takes time to pet his horse, appreciating the connection with another living being. He savors a meal, a drink, a moment of rest. These aren't just gameplay mechanics, they're expressions of Arthur's changing relationship with embodied existence. The psychology of anticipatory grief is also relevant to Arthur's journey. Anticipatory grief is the grief we experience before a loss actually occurs. When we know someone is going to die, or when we know we ourselves are going to die, we begin grieving before the death happens. This grief can be just as intense as grief after death, sometimes more so. Arthur experiences anticipatory grief on multiple levels. He grieves his own impending death, the loss of his future, the experiences he'll never have. He grieves the death of the gang, watching his family fall apart before his eyes. He grieves the loss of his relationship with Dutch, the father figure who has become a stranger. This anticipatory grief is complicated by the fact that Arthur is still living. He has to function, to make decisions, to take action, even while grieving. He can't simply collapse into his grief because there are still things that need to be done, people who need his help, choices that need to be made. The game shows Arthur navigating this tension between grief and action. There are moments when the grief overwhelms him, when he breaks down, when he can barely function. But there are also moments when he sets the grief aside, focuses on the task at hand, does what needs to be done. This oscillation between grief and functioning is psychologically realistic, reflecting how people actually cope with anticipated loss. Let's also consider the psychology of witness in Arthur's story. Throughout the game, Arthur witnesses things. He witnesses Dutch's deterioration, the gang's collapse, the suffering of innocent people. He witnesses beauty and horror, kindness and cruelty, hope and despair. This witnessing is not passive. It changes Arthur, shapes him, becomes part of who he is. The psychologist James Pennebaker has studied the importance of witnessing and testimony in processing trauma. When we witness something, we take it into ourselves. It becomes part of our story. And when we testify about what we've witnessed, we process it, make meaning of it, integrate it into our understanding of the world. Arthur's journal serves as testimony. He writes about what he's seen, what he's done, what he's felt. This writing is a form of witnessing, a way of acknowledging and processing his experiences. The journal becomes a record of Arthur's inner life, a testimony to his transformation. The player also serves as witness to Arthur's story. We watch him struggle, grow, suffer, and ultimately die. Our witnessing matters. It gives Arthur's story meaning, ensures that his journey is not forgotten. In a sense, every player who completes the game becomes a witness to Arthur's life, carrying his story forward. Let's step back and examine Arthur's psychology through several theoretical frameworks. From a psychoanalytic perspective, Arthur's story is about the conflict between the id, ego, and superego. His id, the primitive part of the psyche that seeks immediate gratification, drove his early life of violence and crime. His superego, the internalized voice of morality, was initially shaped by Dutch's philosophy, but gradually developed its own independent standards. His ego, the mediator between ID and superego, struggled throughout the game to balance his violent impulses with his growing moral awareness. The tuberculosis diagnosis can be seen as a crisis that forced Arthur's ego to confront realities it had been avoiding. The defense mechanisms that had protected him, denial, rationalization, compartmentalization, began to fail. He could no longer avoid the truth about himself, about Dutch, about the life he'd lived. This breakdown of defenses, while painful, was necessary for growth. From a humanistic perspective, Arthur's story is about self-actualization, the process of becoming the best version of oneself. Abraham Maslow described self-actualization as the highest level of human development, achieved only after more basic needs are met. Arthur spent most of his life focused on survival and belonging, the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy. Only when facing death did he begin to address higher needs, the need for self-esteem, the need for meaning, the need to become who he truly was. Carl Rogers, another humanistic psychologist, emphasized the importance of congruence, the alignment between one's self-concept and one's actual experience. Arthur spent years in a state of incongruence, seeing himself as Dutch's loyal soldier while experiencing growing doubts about Dutch's leadership. His transformation involved achieving congruence, aligning his self-concept with his actual values and experiences. From a cognitive behavioral perspective, Arthur's story is about changing maladaptive thought patterns. His negative self-schema, the belief that he was fundamentally bad, led to cognitive distortions that maintained his depression and self-destructive behavior. His transformation involved challenging these distortions, gathering evidence against his negative beliefs, and developing more balanced ways of thinking about himself. The behavioral component is equally important. Arthur didn't just change his thoughts, he changed his actions. He helped people instead of hurting them. He showed mercy instead of violence. He protected the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. These behavioral changes reinforced his cognitive changes, creating a positive feedback loop that accelerated his transformation. From an existential perspective, Arthur's story is about confronting the fundamental givens of human existence: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. His diagnosis forced him to confront death directly. His growing independence from Dutch forced him to confront freedom and the responsibility that comes with it. His alienation from the gang forced him to confront isolation, and his search for redemption forced him to confront meaninglessness and create his own meaning. The existential psychologist Irvin Yalom described these confrontations as potentially transformative. When we face the fundamental realities of existence, we can either be destroyed by them or use them as catalysts for growth. Arthur chose growth. He used his confrontation with death to clarify his values, his confrontation with freedom to make authentic choices, his confrontation with isolation to deepen his connections with those he loved, and his confrontation with meaninglessness to create meaning through his actions. From a narrative psychology perspective, Arthur's story is about rewriting his life story. Dan McAdams and other narrative psychologists argue that we understand ourselves through the stories we tell about our lives. Arthur's original story was one of loyalty and violence, of following Dutch and doing what needed to be done. His transformation involved rewriting this story, reinterpreting his past and reimagining his future. The new story Arthur tells is one of redemption. He was a bad man, but he's trying to be better. He did terrible things, but he's trying to make amends. He wasted his life, but he's trying to use what's left for good. This redemption narrative gives Arthur's life coherence and meaning. It doesn't deny the bad, but it contextualizes it within a larger arc of growth and change. Now let's examine some specific psychological concepts that illuminate Arthur's character. Moral injury is a concept developed to describe the psychological damage that occurs when a person participates in or witnesses acts that violate their moral beliefs. Originally applied to combat veterans, the concept applies equally well to Arthur. He has spent decades doing things that violate basic moral principles: killing, stealing, destroying. Even if he rationalized these acts at the time, they left wounds on his psyche. Arthur's transformation can be understood as a process of healing from moral injury. He acknowledges the harm he caused. He takes responsibility for his actions. He tries to make amends where possible. He develops a new moral framework that he can live by. This process doesn't erase the injury, but it allows him to integrate it into a coherent sense of self. Post-traumatic growth is another relevant concept. Psychologists have found that some people who experience trauma don't just recover, they grow. They develop new strengths, new perspectives, new appreciation for life. Arthur's diagnosis is traumatic, but it also catalyzes growth. He becomes more reflective, more compassionate, more authentic. He develops wisdom he didn't have before. The conditions for post-traumatic growth include cognitive processing of the trauma, social support, and the development of new narratives. Arthur engages in all of these. He processes his diagnosis through reflection and journal writing. He receives support from characters like Sister Calderon and Rain's Fall. He develops a new narrative of redemption that gives meaning to his suffering. Attachment theory provides another lens for understanding Arthur. His early experiences of loss and abandonment created an insecure attachment style that affected all his subsequent relationships. He was drawn to Dutch because Dutch offered the secure base he never had. He pushed away Mary because he didn't believe he deserved love. He struggled to connect with others because he expected them to leave or betray him. Arthur's transformation includes a shift in his attachment patterns. He becomes more able to accept love and support. He becomes more willing to be vulnerable. He becomes more capable of genuine connection. This shift is most visible in his relationship with John, which evolves from resentment and competition to genuine care and sacrifice. The concept of the shadow from Jungian psychology is also relevant. The shadow represents the parts of ourselves that we reject or deny, the aspects of our personality that we find unacceptable. Arthur's shadow includes his capacity for violence, his selfishness, his fear. For most of his life, he projected these qualities onto others or acted them out unconsciously. Arthur's transformation involves integrating his shadow. He acknowledges his capacity for violence without being controlled by it. He recognizes his selfishness and chooses generosity instead. He faces his fear and acts courageously anyway. This integration doesn't eliminate the shadow, but it brings it under conscious control, allowing Arthur to choose how he responds to his darker impulses. Let's also consider the role of the player in Arthur's psychology. Red Dead Redemption 2 is unusual in how it handles player agency. Many games give players complete control over their character's personality and choices. Arthur, by contrast, has a defined personality that exists independent of player input. He has his own opinions, his own reactions, his own voice. The player can influence his actions, but not his fundamental character. This creates an interesting psychological dynamic. The player is both Arthur and not Arthur. They make choices for him, but they also watch him make choices they didn't control. They shape his honor level, but they don't shape his internal journey. This dual perspective allows players to both identify with Arthur and observe him from outside. The honor system reflects this duality. Players can choose to play Arthur as honorable or dishonorable, but Arthur's internal struggle remains the same regardless. Even a dishonorable Arthur questions Dutch, reflects on his life, and seeks some form of meaning. The game is suggesting that the capacity for moral reflection exists in everyone, even those who make immoral choices. This has implications for how we understand Arthur's psychology. He's not simply a reflection of player choices. He's a character with his own psychological reality, shaped by his history and circumstances. The player can influence his behaviour, but his psychology follows its own logic. The relationship between player and character also raises questions about moral responsibility. When Arthur does something terrible, who is responsible? The player who chose the action, the character who performed it, the game that made it possible? These questions don't have easy answers, but they add depth to the experience of playing as Arthur. Now let's examine Arthur's legacy and what his story teaches us about psychology. Arthur Morgan's story resonates with players because it touches on universal psychological themes. the search for identity, the struggle with guilt, the desire for redemption, the fear of death, the hope for meaning. These are not just Arthur's concerns, they're human concerns. By engaging with Arthur's story, players engage with their own psychology. The game's portrayal of psychological transformation is remarkably sophisticated. Arthur doesn't change overnight. He doesn't have a single moment of revelation that fixes everything. His transformation is gradual, uneven, and incomplete. He takes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. He has moments of clarity followed by moments of confusion. This is how real psychological change works. The game also portrays the limits of transformation. Arthur can't undo his past. He can't save everyone. He can't become a completely different person. His transformation is real, but it's bounded by his history and circumstances. This is psychologically realistic. We can change, but we can't escape who we've been. We can grow, but we can't start over. Arthur's story also illustrates the importance of relationships in psychological development. Arthur doesn't transform in isolation. He transforms through his relationships with others: Hosea, John, Mary, Sister Calderon, Rain's Fall. These relationships challenge him, support him, and provide models for who he could become. Psychology is not just individual, it's relational. Finally, Arthur's story illustrates the possibility of redemption. Not redemption in a religious sense, though that's present too, but redemption in a psychological sense. The possibility of acknowledging our failures, making amends, and becoming better. The possibility of finding meaning even in a life marked by violence and loss. The possibility of dying with integrity, having given all we had. This is perhaps the most important psychological message of Red Dead Redemption 2. It's never too late to change. It's never too late to try to be better. Even at the end, even facing death, we can choose who we want to be. We can choose to give all we have. But to fully understand Arthur's transformation, we need to explore the specific mechanisms of his change and the subtle ways the game portrays psychological complexity. Consider Arthur's relationship with violence. For most of his life, violence was simply a tool, a means to an end. He didn't enjoy it, not really, but he didn't question it either. Violence was what outlaws did. It was how problems got solved. It was the language Dutch taught him to speak. But the game shows us moments where Arthur's relationship with violence becomes complicated. After certain brutal encounters, Arthur will make comments that reveal his discomfort. He'll say things like, "I don't know about that," or "that was ugly." These aren't the words of a man who enjoys killing. They're the words of a man who has compartmentalized his violence, who has separated the act from the feeling, and who occasionally catches glimpses of what he's really doing. This compartmentalization is a classic defense mechanism. Psychologists describe it as the ability to separate conflicting thoughts, emotions, or experiences into different mental compartments, preventing them from coming into contact with each other. Arthur can be tender with his horse in one moment and brutal with a stranger in the next because he keeps these experiences in separate psychological boxes. The tuberculosis diagnosis breaks down these compartments. When you're dying, the walls between different parts of yourself start to crumble. Arthur can no longer keep his violence separate from his sense of self. He has to integrate it to acknowledge that the man who pets his horse and the man who beats debtors are the same person. This integration is painful, but it's also necessary for growth. The game's honor system reflects this integration process. As Arthur's honour increases, his internal monologue changes. He becomes more reflective, more critical of violence, more aware of its consequences. He's not just behaving differently, he's thinking differently. The compartments are breaking down, and a more unified self is emerging. Let's examine Arthur's dreams, which provide a window into his unconscious mind. Throughout the game, Arthur has dreams and visions that reflect his psychological state. He dreams of a deer or a wolf, depending on his honour level. He has visions of past events, of people he's lost, of choices he's made. These dreams aren't random. They're the unconscious mind processing experiences that the conscious mind can't fully handle. The deer represents Arthur's potential for goodness, his connection to nature, his capacity for peace. When Arthur sees the deer in his dreams, it's his unconscious telling him that this potential still exists, that he hasn't completely lost himself to violence. The deer is hope, possibility, the part of Arthur that Dutch never touched. The wolf represents Arthur's predatory nature, his capacity for violence, his survival instincts. When Arthur sees the wolf, it's his unconscious acknowledging the reality of who he's been, the hunter, the killer, the outlaw. The wolf isn't evil, but it is dangerous. It's the part of Arthur that has kept him alive but has also caused so much harm. The fact that these animals appear based on honour level is psychologically significant. It suggests that Arthur's unconscious is responsive to his conscious choices. When he chooses compassion, his unconscious rewards him with images of peace. When he chooses violence, his unconscious confronts him with images of predation. The psyche is always keeping score even when we're not aware of it. Freud would have had a field day with Arthur's dreams. The deer and wolf can be seen as representations of the life instinct and death instinct, eros and thanatos, the fundamental drives that Freud believed motivated all human behaviour. Arthur's journey is a struggle between these instincts, between the desire to create and connect and the desire to destroy and dominate. Jung would interpret the dreams differently, seeing the deer and wolf as aspects of Arthur's shadow and self. The shadow contains the parts of ourselves we reject, while the self represents our potential for wholeness. Arthur's dreams are invitations to integrate these aspects, to acknowledge both the deer and the wolf as parts of who he is. Let's also consider Arthur's relationship with nature, which is one of the most psychologically revealing aspects of his character. Arthur is deeply connected to the natural world. He hunts, fishes, camps under the stars. He knows the names of plants and animals. He appreciates beauty in a way that seems incongruous with his violent profession. His journal is filled with sketches of wildlife, landscapes, and natural phenomena. This connection to nature serves several psychological functions. First, it provides escape from the stress and violence of outlaw life. When Arthur is fishing by a quiet stream, he's not thinking about Dutch's plans or the Pinkertons. He's present, focused, at peace. Nature offers a respite from the constant vigilance that outlaw life requires. Second, nature provides a sense of perspective. The mountains don't care about gang politics. The rivers don't know about bounties and robberies. In the face of natural grandeur, human concerns seem smaller, more manageable. Arthur's connection to nature helps him maintain psychological equilibrium in a chaotic world. Third, nature represents authenticity. The natural world operates according to its own laws, indifferent to human pretense and manipulation. For Arthur, who has spent his life surrounded by lies and schemes, nature offers something real. The deer doesn't have an agenda. The sunset isn't trying to manipulate him. In nature, Arthur can be himself. The game reinforces this connection through its mechanics. Players who spend time in nature, hunting and exploring, tend to develop a deeper appreciation for Arthur's character. They see him in moments of quiet contemplation, hear his comments about the beauty around him, and understand that there's more to this man than violence. Arthur's sketches in his journal are particularly revealing. He draws what he sees with care and attention, capturing details that a less observant person would miss. These sketches show us an Arthur who notices things, who appreciates beauty, who has an inner life that goes far beyond his role as Dutch's enforcer. The psychological term for this is aesthetic sensitivity, the capacity to perceive and appreciate beauty. Research suggests that aesthetic sensitivity is associated with openness to experience, emotional depth, and psychological well-being. Arthur's aesthetic sensitivity is evidence of a rich inner life that his outlaw persona conceals. Now let's examine Arthur's humour, which is another window into his psychology. Arthur has a dry, sardonic wit that emerges throughout the game. He makes jokes, often at his own expense. He engages in playful banter with other gang members. He responds to absurd situations with deadpan observations that reveal a keen awareness of life's ironies. This humour serves important psychological functions. First, it's a coping mechanism. Humour allows Arthur to process difficult experiences without being overwhelmed by them. When he jokes about his situation, he's creating psychological distance, making the unbearable bearable. Second, humour is a form of connection. When Arthur jokes with Charles or Lenny or Sadie, he's building relationships, creating shared moments of levity in a dark world. Humour is social glue, and Arthur uses it to maintain bonds with the people he cares about. Third, humour reveals intelligence. Arthur's wit requires quick thinking, verbal dexterity, and an understanding of social dynamics. His jokes show us that he's smarter than he often pretends to be, more perceptive than his rough exterior suggests. The game gives Arthur some genuinely funny lines, and the voice actor Roger Clark delivers them with perfect timing. These moments of humour make Arthur more human, more relatable. They remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, people find ways to laugh. But Arthur's humour also has a darker edge. Sometimes his jokes are self-deprecating to the point of self-harm. He dismisses his own worth, mocks his own hopes, treats his own life as a joke. This kind of humour can be a sign of depression, a way of expressing pain while maintaining a facade of indifference. As the game progresses and Arthur's health declines, his humour changes. It becomes more reflective, more philosophical. He jokes about death, about legacy, about the meaning of life. These jokes aren't just coping mechanisms, they're attempts to make sense of his situation, to find meaning in the face of mortality. Let's talk about Arthur's relationship with money and material possessions. For an outlaw, Arthur has a surprisingly ambivalent relationship with wealth. He robs and steals, but he doesn't seem particularly interested in money for its own sake. He gives money away freely, donates to the camp, helps strangers without expecting payment. When he talks about one more score, there's no greed in his voice, only weariness. This ambivalence reflects Arthur's deeper values. He's not motivated by material gain. He's motivated by loyalty, by belonging, by the need to prove himself to Dutch. Money is just a means to these ends, not an end in itself. The game reinforces this through its mechanics. Players can accumulate vast wealth, but there's relatively little to spend it on. The message is clear. Money isn't what matters. What matters is relationships, choices, the kind of person you become. Arthur's relationship with his horse is more emotionally significant than his relationship with money. He names his horse, talks to it, cares for it. When a horse dies, Arthur mourns. This attachment to an animal, rather than to wealth, reveals Arthur's true values. He cares about living things, about connection, about loyalty. Money is just paper. In his final moments, Arthur thanks his horse. It's a small detail, but it's psychologically profound. In his last breath, Arthur isn't thinking about the money he stole or the scores he pulled. He's thinking about a creature that was loyal to him, that carried him through danger, that never judged him. That's what matters to Arthur. That's who he really is. Let's examine Arthur's relationship with religion and spirituality. Arthur is not a religious man in any conventional sense. He doesn't pray, doesn't attend church, doesn't speak of God with any certainty. When asked about his beliefs, he's evasive, uncertain. He's seen too much suffering to believe in a benevolent deity, too much cruelty to trust in divine justice. But Arthur is spiritual in a broader sense. He believes in something, even if he can't name it. He believes in loyalty, in honor, in doing right by the people you love. He believes that actions matter, that choices have consequences, that there's difference between good and evil, even if the line is blurry. The conversations with Sister Calderon are crucial here. She doesn't try to convert Arthur or preach to him. She simply offers compassion, acceptance, and the possibility of redemption. Arthur responds to this not because he suddenly believes in God, but because he recognizes genuine goodness when he sees it. Sister Calderon represents a kind of faith that Arthur can respect. Faith expressed through action, through service, through love. She doesn't just talk about helping people, she actually helps them. She doesn't just preach forgiveness, she actually forgives. This authenticity resonates with Arthur, who has spent his life surrounded by people whose words and actions don't match. Arthur's spirituality is also expressed through his connection to nature, which we discussed earlier. There's something sacred in his appreciation of beauty, his respect for the natural world, his sense of wonder at the vastness of the landscape. This isn't organized religion, but it is a form of transcendence, a recognition that there's something larger than himself. The game's ending reinforces this spiritual dimension. Arthur dies watching the sunrise, a moment of natural beauty that transcends the violence and chaos of his life. Whether you interpret this as a religious experience or simply an aesthetic one, it's clear that Arthur finds peace in something beyond himself. Now let's explore Arthur's relationship with time and mortality in more depth. Before his diagnosis, Arthur lived as if he had unlimited time. There was always tomorrow, always another chance, always one more score before things would change. This is how most people live, in a state of what philosophers call temporal illusion, the belief that the future stretches endlessly before us. The diagnosis shatters this illusion. Arthur suddenly has a deadline, literally. Every cough reminds him that his time is running out. Every sunset might be his last. This awareness of mortality transforms his relationship with time. Psychologists have studied how awareness of mortality affects behavior and cognition. Terror management theory suggests that reminders of death can trigger defensive responses as people try to bolster their self-esteem and worldview against the threat of annihilation. But research also shows that mortality awareness can have positive effects, increasing gratitude, deepening relationships, and clarifying priorities. Arthur experiences both responses. Initially, he's defensive, trying to maintain his normal routines and deny the reality of his situation. But gradually he shifts toward the positive response. He becomes more grateful for small pleasures. He deepens his relationships with John, Charles, and Sadie. He clarifies his priorities, focusing on what really matters rather than what Dutch says matters. The game conveys this shift through subtle changes in Arthur's behaviour and dialogue. He lingers longer at beautiful vistas. He takes more time with conversations. He expresses appreciation for things he previously took for granted. These aren't dramatic changes, but they're psychologically significant. Arthur is learning to be present, to appreciate the moment, to live fully in the time he has left. This is what existential psychologists call authentic existence, living in full awareness of mortality rather than fleeing from it. Authentic existence isn't morbid or depressing. It's actually more alive, more engaged, more meaningful than the defensive existence most people maintain. Arthur achieves authentic existence through his confrontation with death. Let's also examine the psychology of Arthur's physical decline. Tuberculosis doesn't just affect Arthur's lungs, it affects his entire sense of self. He was always strong, capable, physically imposing. His body was a tool he could rely on, a source of confidence and power. As the disease progresses, this foundation crumbles. Arthur becomes weaker, thinner, more fragile. He coughs blood, struggles to breathe, loses the physical dominance that defined him. This is a profound psychological challenge. When your identity is partly based on physical capability, losing that capability means losing part of yourself. The game portrays this decline with unflinching honesty. Arthur's face becomes gaunt, his movements become laboured. Other characters comment on his appearance, asking if he's okay, expressing concern. Arthur can no longer hide what's happening to him. This physical decline forces Arthur to find new sources of identity and worth. He can't be the strongest anymore, so he has to be something else. He becomes wiser, more compassionate, more focused on helping others. His value shifts from what he can do to who he is. This is a common pattern in people facing serious illness. When physical capabilities decline, psychological and spiritual growth often accelerates. People discover depths they didn't know they had. They find meaning in relationships and values rather than achievements and abilities. Arthur's journey follows this pattern. The game also shows how Arthur's illness affects his relationships. Some people, like Micah, use his weakness against him. Others, like Charles and Sadie, become more protective and supportive. Arthur learns who his real friends are, who values him for himself rather than for what he can do for them. Let's examine the psychology of Arthur's final choices in more detail. In the game's climax, Arthur faces a series of choices that reveal his psychological state. He can choose to help John escape, or to go back for the money. He can choose to confront Micah, or to flee. These choices aren't just plot points, they're psychological tests. The choice to help John is the choice of generativity over self-interest. Arthur knows he's dying. He could spend his last hours trying to secure money for himself, trying to get revenge on his enemies, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his life. Instead, he chooses to help someone else, to give John a chance at the life Arthur never had. This choice reflects Arthur's psychological growth. Earlier in the game, he might have made a different choice. He might have prioritized the gang's money, Dutch's approval, his own survival. But Arthur has changed. He's learned that some things matter more than money, more than approval, more than survival. The confrontation with Micah is equally significant. Micah represents everything Arthur has rejected: selfishness, cruelty, betrayal. By confronting Micah, Arthur is confronting the shadow side of outlaw life, the version of himself he could have become. It's a final act of differentiation, a declaration that Arthur is not Micah, that he chose a different path. The final scene, whether Arthur dies watching the sunrise or dies in the dirt, is the culmination of his psychological journey. The high honor ending shows a man at peace, a man who found meaning in his suffering, a man who gave all he had. The low honor ending shows a man still struggling, still afraid, still incomplete. Both endings are psychologically valid. Both reflect possible outcomes of Arthur's journey. But even the low honor ending contains redemption of a sort. Arthur still helps John. He still confronts Micah. He still chooses something beyond pure self-interest. His fear and incompleteness don't negate his growth. They just show that growth is hard, that transformation is never complete, that we all die with unfinished business. Let's consider what Arthur's story teaches us about the psychology of redemption. Redemption is a complex psychological concept. It's not just about being forgiven or making amends. It's about transforming the meaning of past actions, integrating them into a new narrative, and becoming a different person while acknowledging who you've been. Arthur's redemption doesn't erase his past. He killed people. He hurt people. He participated in violence and theft and destruction. These facts don't change. What changes is their meaning, their place in Arthur's story, their relationship to who Arthur becomes. Before his transformation, Arthur's violence was just violence, acts performed without reflection, justified by loyalty to Dutch. After his transformation, the violence becomes part of a larger narrative, the darkness that makes the light meaningful, the sins that make redemption necessary. Arthur's past doesn't disappear, but it's recontextualized. This is how psychological redemption works. We can't change what we did, but we can change what it means. We can integrate our failures into a story of growth. We can use our mistakes as motivation for change. We can become people who have done terrible things and also done beautiful things, who have caused harm and also healed harm. Arthur achieves this integration. He acknowledges his violence without being defined by it. He takes responsibility for his actions without being paralyzed by guilt. He uses his remaining time to create new meaning, to write a new chapter that doesn't erase the old chapters, but does complete the story in a different way. The psychological research on redemption supports this understanding. Studies of people who have transformed their lives, former criminals, recovering addicts, survivors of trauma, show that redemption involves narrative reconstruction. People don't just change their behavior, they change their story. They reinterpret their past, finding meaning in suffering, seeing growth in failure, understanding their journey as leading somewhere rather than nowhere. Arthur's journal is a tool for this narrative reconstruction. By writing about his experiences, Arthur is processing them, making sense of them, integrating them into a coherent story. The journal entries become more reflective as the game progresses, showing Arthur actively engaged in the work of meaning making. Let's examine the psychology of Arthur's relationships with the other gang members. Each relationship reveals different aspects of Arthur's character. His relationship with Charles shows his capacity for genuine friendship, for respecting someone different from himself, for learning from others. Charles is calm, thoughtful, principled, everything Arthur wishes he could be. Their friendship is based on mutual respect and shared values. His relationship with Sadie shows his capacity for recognizing strength in others, for supporting someone's growth, for treating women as equals. Sadie transforms from a grieving widow to a fierce warrior, and Arthur supports this transformation without trying to control it. He sees her potential and helps her realize it. His relationship with Lenny shows his capacity for mentorship, for caring about younger gang members, for seeing beyond race in a racist era. Arthur genuinely likes Lenny, enjoys his company, mourns his death. Their friendship is uncomplicated in a way that Arthur's other relationships aren't. His relationship with Sean shows his capacity for tolerating annoyance with affection. Sean is loud, boastful, sometimes irritating. But Arthur cares about him anyway, is genuinely affected by his death, remembers him with fondness. This capacity to love imperfect people is psychologically healthy. His relationship with Kieran shows his capacity for change. Arthur initially distrusts Kieran, treats him harshly, sees him as an outsider, but over time Arthur comes to accept Kieran, to see him as part of the gang, to mourn his brutal death. This evolution shows Arthur's ability to revise his judgments, to overcome initial prejudice, to let people prove themselves. His relationship with Tilly shows his protective instincts, his willingness to help someone escape their past, his recognition that people deserve second chances. Tilly has a history she's trying to leave behind, and Arthur supports her without judgment. His relationship with Mary Beth shows his appreciation for gentleness and creativity. Mary Beth is a writer, a dreamer, someone who sees beauty in the world. Arthur respects this, encourages it, protects it. He recognizes that the gang needs people like Mary Beth, people who remind them of what they're fighting for. His relationship with Uncle shows his tolerance for human weakness. Uncle is lazy, unreliable, often drunk. Arthur complains about him constantly. But there's affection underneath the complaints, a recognition that Uncle is part of the family despite his flaws. His relationship with Pearson shows his appreciation for those who keep things running. Pearson isn't glamorous, but he feeds the gang, maintains the camp, does the unglamorous work that makes survival possible. Arthur recognizes this contribution even when others don't. His relationship with Grimshaw shows his respect for strength and competence. Miss Grimshaw runs the camp with an iron hand, maintaining order and discipline. Arthur respects her authority, defers to her in domestic matters, recognizes her as a leader in her own domain. Each of these relationships adds dimension to Arthur's character. He's not just Dutch's enforcer, he's a friend, a mentor, a protector, a colleague. He has the capacity for many kinds of relationships, many kinds of love. This psychological richness is what makes him feel real. Let's also examine the psychology of Arthur's enemies. Arthur's relationship with the Pinkertons, particularly Agent Milton, reveals his attitude toward authority and civilization. Milton represents the law, the government, the encroaching modern world that Dutch rails against. Arthur hates Milton, but it's a complicated hatred. Part of Arthur recognizes that Milton has a point. The gang are criminals. They have killed people, robbed people, caused suffering. Milton isn't wrong to pursue them. Arthur's hatred of Milton is partly hatred of this truth, hatred of the mirror Milton holds up. But Arthur also sees Milton's hypocrisy. Milton serves powerful interests, protects the wealthy, enforces laws that benefit some and harm others. The civilization Milton represents isn't just or fair. It's a different kind of violence, dressed up in respectability. This ambivalence reflects Arthur's broader psychological conflict. He knows the outlaw life is wrong, but he also knows that the alternative isn't simply right. There's no clean choice, no clear path to virtue. Arthur is trapped between two flawed worlds, belonging fully to neither. Arthur's relationship with Colm O'Driscoll reveals his capacity for hatred and his limits. Colm is a genuine villain, cruel and sadistic in ways that even Dutch isn't. Arthur hates Colm with a purity he doesn't feel toward other enemies. When Colm is finally hanged, Arthur feels satisfaction. But even here, Arthur's psychology is complex. He doesn't gloat over Colm's death. He doesn't celebrate. He simply acknowledges that justice has been done, that a bad man has met a bad end. There's no joy in it, just grim satisfaction. Arthur's relationship with the Braithwaites and Greys reveals his contempt for hypocrisy. These wealthy families pretend to be respectable while engaging in crimes as bad as anything the gang does. Arthur sees through their pretense, recognizes them as criminals in fancy clothes. His contempt for them is partly contempt for the lie that wealth equals virtue. Now let's explore the deeper philosophical dimensions of Arthur's journey. Arthur's story engages with fundamental questions that philosophers have grappled with for centuries. What makes a good life? What do we owe to others? How should we face death? What is the relationship between who we are and what we do? The question of identity is central. Is Arthur defined by his actions or by something deeper? If he's defined by his actions, then he's a killer, a thief, a bad man. But if there's something deeper, some essential self that exists beneath the actions, then maybe that self can be redeemed. The game suggests that both are true. Arthur is his actions, but he's also more than his actions. He's the sum of his choices, but he's also the capacity to make different choices. His identity is not fixed but fluid, not determined but open. This is a hopeful vision of human nature, one that allows for change and growth. The question of moral responsibility is equally complex. Arthur did terrible things, but he did them in a context. He was shaped by trauma, manipulated by Dutch, trapped by circumstances. How much responsibility does he bear? How much can be attributed to factors beyond his control? The game doesn't offer easy answers. Arthur takes responsibility for his actions, doesn't make excuses, doesn't blame others. But the game also shows us the forces that shaped him, the childhood trauma, the surrogate father, the outlaw life. We're invited to hold both truths. Arthur is responsible, and Arthur was shaped by forces beyond his control. The question of meaning is perhaps the deepest. What gives life meaning? Is it achievement, relationship, pleasure, virtue? Arthur's journey suggests that meaning comes from connection and contribution, from loving others and helping them, from giving rather than taking. In his final days, Arthur doesn't seek pleasure or achievement. He seeks to help John, to protect the innocent, to do some good before he dies. This is where he finds meaning, not in what he gets, but in what he gives. The game is making a philosophical claim. Meaning comes from self-transcendence, from focusing on something beyond ourselves. The question of death is unavoidable. How should we face our mortality? With denial, with fear, with acceptance. Arthur moves through all of these responses, ultimately achieving a kind of peace. He doesn't welcome death, but he doesn't flee from it either. He faces it with courage, with dignity, with a sense of completion. This is what philosophers call dying well, meeting death in a way that's consistent with one's values, that completes rather than negates one's life. Arthur dies well. He dies fighting for something he believes in, protecting someone he loves, giving all he has. His death is not a defeat, but a culmination. Let's consider the broader cultural significance of Arthur's psychological journey. Arthur Morgan has become one of the most beloved characters in video game history, and his psychological depth is a major reason why. Players don't just enjoy playing as Arthur, they care about him. They want him to find redemption. They mourn his death. They carry his story with them long after the game ends. This emotional connection reflects something important about human psychology. We are drawn to stories of transformation, of redemption, of people becoming better than they were. These stories give us hope for ourselves, suggest that change is possible, that our past doesn't have to determine our future. Arthur's story is particularly powerful because it doesn't offer easy redemption. Arthur doesn't become a saint. He doesn't undo his past. He doesn't get a happy ending. His redemption is partial, incomplete, cut short by death. And yet, it's real. It matters. It changes something. This realistic portrayal of redemption resonates with players because it matches their own experience. Real change is hard. Real growth is slow. Real redemption is never complete. By showing us a redemption that's messy and partial, the game validates our own struggles, our own incomplete transformations, our own ongoing efforts to be better. Arthur's story also reflects contemporary concerns about masculinity. Arthur embodies a traditional masculine ideal, strong, stoic, capable of violence. But the game shows the costs of this ideal: the emotional repression, the inability to ask for help, the isolation. Arthur's transformation involves developing a more complete masculinity, one that includes vulnerability, emotional expression, and connection. This is a message that resonates in an era when traditional masculinity is being questioned. Arthur shows that strength and sensitivity aren't opposites, that a man can be tough and tender, that vulnerability is not weakness. His journey offers a model for masculine growth that many players find meaningful. Arthur's story also engages with questions of American identity. The Old West is a foundational American myth, a story of freedom, individualism, and self-reliance. Arthur's journey complicates this myth, showing the violence and exploitation that accompanied westward expansion, the destruction of indigenous peoples, the costs of civilization. By making us care about an outlaw, the game invites us to question our assumptions about law and order, about progress and civilization, about who the good guys really are. Arthur isn't a hero in any simple sense, but he's not a villain either. He's a human being caught in historical forces larger than himself, trying to find meaning in a world that's changing faster than he can adapt. Arthur Morgan's journey is a masterclass in psychological complexity. He's not a simple character with a simple arc. He's a man shaped by trauma, defined by loyalty, transformed by mortality. He contains contradictions, violence and tenderness, cynicism and hope, self-loathing and self-respect. He's capable of terrible cruelty and profound compassion. He's human in all the messy complexity that implies. The game invites us to inhabit Arthur's psychology, to see the world through his eyes, to feel what he feels. This is the power of narrative. It allows us to experience lives we'll never live, to understand perspectives we'd never otherwise encounter. By playing as Arthur, we expand our psychological horizons. Arthur's transformation shows us that change is possible at any point in life. It's never too late to question our assumptions, to examine our loyalties, to become someone different. Arthur was in his late 30s when he began to change, with decades of violence behind him. If he can transform, so can we. Arthur's acceptance of mortality shows us how to face our own deaths. We will all die. The question is how we'll live with that knowledge. Arthur shows us that mortality awareness can be a gift, a clarifying force that helps us focus on what really matters. By facing death honestly, we can live more fully. Arthur's redemption shows us that our past doesn't have to define our future. We've all done things we regret, hurt people we love, failed to live up to our potential. Arthur shows us that these failures don't have to be the end of the story. We can acknowledge them, learn from them, and use them as motivation to be better. Arthur's relationships show us the importance of connection. He doesn't transform alone. He transforms through his relationships with others, through the love and support and challenge they provide. We are social creatures, and our growth happens in relationship. Arthur reminds us to nurture our connections, to let people in, to accept help when it's offered. Arthur's final words, "I gave you all I had," show us what a life well lived looks like. It's not about accumulating wealth or achieving fame or avoiding suffering. It's about giving fully, loving completely, holding nothing back. Arthur gave everything he had, and in the end, that was enough. Those words echo long after the game ends. They're not just Arthur's epitaph, they're a challenge to everyone who hears them. Have we given all we have? Have we held nothing back? Have we loved fully, lived completely, faced our mortality with courage? Arthur's final words are a mirror, reflecting our own lives back at us, asking us to consider whether we're living with the same intensity, the same commitment, the same willingness to give everything. That was everything. The sun rises over the mountains. Arthur Morgan takes his last breath. And somewhere, in the hearts of millions of players, a complicated, flawed, beautiful man lives on. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a human being struggling with the same questions we all struggle with, finding the same answers we all hope to find. Who am I? What have I done? What can I still do? These are the questions that define a human life. They're the questions Arthur wrestled with in his final months, the questions that drove his transformation, the questions that gave his death meaning, and they're the questions we all face, whether we acknowledge them or not. Arthur found his answers. The question is whether we'll find ours. His story reminds us that we're all works in progress, all capable of change, all worthy of redemption. It reminds us that our choices matter, that our relationships matter, that how we face death matters. It reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, there is light to be found, meaning to be made, love to be given. Arthur Morgan gave all he had, and in doing so, he showed us what it means to be human. The game ends, but the questions remain. They stay with us, these questions Arthur wrestled with. They become our questions, our struggles, our journey. And maybe that's the greatest gift Arthur gives us. Not answers, but better questions. Not solutions, but deeper understanding. Not a map, but a compass. We all have our own mountains to climb, our own sunrises to witness, our own final breaths to take. Arthur's journey doesn't tell us how to live our lives, but it shows us that the journey matters, that the struggle is worthwhile, that redemption is possible. Whatever your past, whatever your struggles, you can still choose who you want to be. You can still give all you have. You can still watch the sun rise and know that you did your best with what you were given. And that, in the end, is what makes us human.